Morality has become a very misapplied, abused, and confused concept today. We are expected to behave morally and do the right thing, but what determines morality and to whom does it apply? The default assumption today among most people in the West is moral universalism, that all peoples deserve the same behavioral standards regardless of context, group membership, or reciprocal obligations. But this is both intellectually incoherent and civilizationally destructive because it denies the actual conditions under which moral norms evolve and operate. In fact, moral universalism is an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. The word morality derives from the Latin moralis, coined by the Roman statesman Cicero, literally meaning pertaining to customs or manners, that is, to the internal norms governing conduct within a community. Morality, then, was never a universal code applied uniformly across humanity, but a local, communal grammar of cooperation. And because there is no universal community, there cannot be any universal morality. Now, how do moral codes emerge in the first place? Let's begin with first principles. The first principle of the universe is evolutionary computation. Evolutionary computation refers to the universal process by which nature, biology, cognition, and civilization solves problems through iterative cycles of variation, competition, selection, and retention. This process operates at every scale, from atoms forming molecules to humans forming societies, and is measurable as a reduction in entropy through increasing order. In human terms, evolutionary computation is expressed through adaptive learning, reciprocal cooperation, and institutional evolution. Why are reciprocal cooperation and institutional formation necessary? Well, the first principle of human behavior is acquisitionism. To survive, all humans must acquire various scarce resources. If man were a solitary mammal, like a tiger or a wolverine, cooperation and therefore moral norms would never have arisen, and all behavior would be strategic, opportunistic, and amoral. But man is a social creature, or in Aristotle's words, a political animal. This means our survival depends on organizing into groups for collective acquisition and defense of resources. There never was a, quote, state of nature in which individuals lived free, equal, and independent. That is erroneous Enlightenment mythology. Man has always been a groupish animal, and therefore subject to the logic of intra-group coordination. This brings us to the foundation of moral reasoning, or the first question of ethics, which is, why shouldn't I kill you and take your stuff? To which the only real answer is, 1. Because cooperation with me will yield greater long-term returns than predation, or 2. Because I will retaliate, making predation unprofitable. The first answer, an invitation to reciprocal cooperation, is the seed of moral behavior. The second answer, a threat of retaliation, is the basis of deterrence. Between them lies the logic of in-group coordination. Moral norms emerge because it is in the group's interest to suppress internal predation in favor of sustained cooperation. Moral codes and laws evolved to protect the group's demonstrated interests, what we call property, because evolutionary computation favors group strategies that maximize durable cooperation. Groups that suppress internal defection and align incentives around shared interests increase their evolutionary fitness. Those that fail to do so are eliminated by conquest or decay. To recap, survival requires acquisition and defense of what is acquired requires cooperation requires constraints to prevent parasitism, these internal constraints become shared norms become customs, and some customs are even formalized into laws. Thus, the development of a moral system, the iterative selection of norms that optimize group coordination under scarcity and risk, is itself the output of evolutionary computation, remembering and retaining what works to preserve the group. But the world is not made up of a single group. It is made of many competing groups, each organized around its own group evolutionary strategy. This then brings us to the first question of politics, which is, why do we not kill you, take your land, your goods, your women, and enslave your children? Again, only two real answers exist. 1. Because cooperation with us is more profitable than predation, or 2. Because we will retaliate with sufficient force to make your attempt unprofitable. This is the true nature of geopolitics, delayed conquest in favor of productive exchange under threat of retaliation. Where mutual benefit can be established, peace and trade are possible. Where mutual benefit fails to be established, however, avoidance or predation may become the rational group strategy. In order for cooperation to be preferable, it must minimize the costs of acquisition, maximize survival and prosperity, and enable the in-group to outcompete entropy and rivals through cumulative gains that conflict and avoidance cannot achieve. Having established that morality emerges from the need to preserve cooperation within the group, we can now classify all behavior within the ternary logic of cooperation. 1. Irreciprocity, which includes parasitism, theft, fraud, or predation. These are acts that impose costs without consent or compensation. 2. Reciprocity, which includes exchange, alliance, or integration. These offer mutual benefit under shared rules. 3. Boycott, which includes exclusion or avoidance. This is non-cooperation without aggression. Reciprocity requires that interactions be voluntary, no coercion, informed, full disclosure of relevant terms, mutually productive, no zero-sum parasitism, warranted, liable for harm or failure, and externality-free, no third-party costs without consent. Irreciprocity is the breach of any of these criteria, whether by deception, coercion, or free-riding, and boycott is strategic non-engagement, where cooperation is either unprofitable or unjustified. We can now define the moral spectrum in operational terms. Morality equals reciprocity. That is, morality applies within reciprocal networks where mutual benefit is possible and expected, such as between in-group members or allied groups engaged in mutual benefit under shared enforcement and constraints. Immorality equals irreciprocity. That is, immorality denotes violations of reciprocity, parasitism, defection, or imposition of costs without compensation within that same network, which constitute violations of expected cooperation. Amorality equals absence of reciprocity. That is, amorality applies to domains where no reciprocal obligation is recognized and no shared norms are binding, such as relations with non-cooperative outgroups, i.e. engaging rivals, existential or survival conflicts, i.e. engaging enemies, or interactions with non-agentic entities, for example, machines and non-human animals. In other words, amoral actions are not morally judged or justified or condemned, but strategically evaluated. Recognizing this boundary is essential to avoid the false universalization of moral obligations across incompatible domains, preventing moral conflation where reciprocity is absent and moral judgment no longer applies. For example, are U.S. tariffs on China moral, immoral, or amoral? The answer is amoral, because the United States and China are not members of a shared cooperative network. They are civilizational rivals, if not latent enemies. Economics in this context is war by other means. Tariffs are not a violation of moral obligation, they are a strategic act of self-defense within the logic of intergroup conflict. It is critical to understand that only reciprocal relations warrant moral consideration. In fact, extending moral behavior to competitors outside the bounds of reciprocity is not only not required, it is not permitted, because it de facto constitutes a defection against one's own group. However well-intentioned, such defection is not a virtue, it is treason. To act morally towards a rival is nothing less than an immoral act against one's own. To extend morality beyond the bounds of reciprocity is not just irrational, it's parasitic. I'll now make a clarification. To say that morality applies only within cooperative bounds is not to suggest that all actions outside those bounds are therefore good, heroic, or justified. Amoral does not mean beyond criticism. It merely means that they are outside the domain of morality altogether and belong instead to the realm of existential or strategic conflict. Amoral acts may still be ignoble, debased, or strategically pointless, and most of the time, acts of savagery do in fact damage one's own group's internal cohesion, external reputation, or long-term viability, and so are not really amoral after all. Yet, to remain consistent, we must categorize behavior correctly and evaluate amoral actions on strategic, aesthetic, or civilizational grounds, not moral ones. The failure to uphold this distinction has led to moral inflation, the indiscriminate application of moral norms where they do not apply, and the breakdown of moral clarity in domains that require strategic reasoning. Indeed, the modern world is sick with moral universalism. We are told to love our enemies, subsidize our parasites, grant rights to traitors, and show deference to those who seek our displacement. But this is not moral progress. It is the suicidal application of in-group ethics to out-group threats. Morality is not a universal prescription. It is a local adaptation, a behavioral grammar for sustaining cooperation among friends. It binds those who share norms, enforce rules, and defend the commons. It does not bind those who offer nothing in return. What is good for the lion is bad for the gazelle, and vice versa. And just as for any other animal, what is good or right in human affairs is relative to identity and group strategy. As Rurik Skywalker puts it, your moral crisis is actually an identity crisis in disguise. Everything beyond the interests and strategy of the group exits the domain of morality and enters that of strategy. To conclude, acquisition is necessary for survival and requires having a team. Effective teamwork requires team players that refrain from immoral, i.e. irreciprocal behavior. Reciprocity is measured and a system of morality thus emerges. These moral considerations we apply to the in-group do not and cannot apply to all, but only to in-group members and in-group allies. But isn't that just tribalism? Isn't that identity politics? Yes, and rightly so. Resources are limited, and competition is permanent. For the group to survive, it must organize around shared interests. To organize, it must have an identity, and thus, man is an irreducibly political animal, a cooperative, groupish, identity-bound strategist. From this follows the fundamental political distinction, us versus them. Therefore, all politics is identity politics. All identity is for organization, and all organization is for the acquisition and defense of shared interests. All survivable order is a record of what works, what persisted, what coordinated, what defended, what evolved. That record is not a moral philosophy, but cosmic memory, as memory equals persistence under constraint. Civilization created and sustained is the record of evolution's computation. It records only what survives. So, if you want your culture, your story, your civilization, your people to remain part of that memory, then remember, there is no morality outside the circle of the in-group and their allies. There are no rights for those who do not return them. There is no virtue in feeding your enemies. It's time to abandon the delusion of universal morality and get real. Morality is for friends only.